"Save him." A voice like grinding stones reverberated through the small, shadowed clinic. The front door hung off its bottom hinge, splintered by the sheer force of the massive, midnight black wolf standing in the threshold. Freezing rain poured from its matted fur, mingling with thick, dark blood pooling on the linoleum. Between the beast's razor-sharp jaws, gripped with terrifying, desperate gentleness, was a limp, gray bundle. A pup. It wasn't breathing. Lisa didn't scream. She didn't cower. She looked from the terrifying, luminous golden eyes of the Alpha King's beast to the devastatingly still chest of the infant shifter. "Put him on the metal table," she ordered, her voice slicing clean through the raging storm outside. "Now, if you want him to live, you do exactly as I say." The sheer mass of the beast seemed to suck the oxygen from the tiny examination room. Lisa backed away just enough to allow the monstrous wolf to approach the stainless steel table under the harsh fluorescent lights. The creature's paws left heavy, crimson-stained prints across the pristine floor, the sound of its claws clicking against the tiles, a rhythmic drumbeat of pure terror. But Lisa pushed the terror down, locking it away in a cold, clinical box inside her mind. Panic had no place here. The wolf lowered its massive head, opening jaws that could snap a grown man in half, and delicately deposited the lifeless pup onto the cold metal. The beast stepped back, releasing a low, rattling whine that vibrated in Lisa's chest. Lisa moved in instantly. The pup was barely the size of a loaf of bread, covered in fine, silvery down that was plastered to its skin with mud and blood. Its eyes were tightly shut, its tongue, a terrifying shade of blue, hanging from the side of its small mouth. There was no rise and fall of the chest, no heartbeat fluttering beneath the fragile ribs. "Time is tissue," Lisa muttered to herself, stripping off her thick wool cardigan and tossing it aside. She grabbed a small, specialized oxygen mask and a bulb syringe from the tray beside the table. First, the airway. She tilted the pup's head back gently, inserting the tip of the syringe into the small snout and suctioning out a horrific mixture of amniotic fluid, mud, and blood. She repeated the process in the mouth, her hands moving with practiced, relentless speed. The Alpha King's beast paced behind her. The heavy thud of its paws and the ragged, wet sound of its breathing filled the room, a looming threat of violence if she failed. The air crackled with dominant alpha energy, heavy and suffocating, demanding obedience, demanding a miracle. "Clear," Lisa whispered, tossing the syringe into the sink. She pressed 2 fingers against the pup's chest, right over the tiny heart. Nothing. Not a flutter. "Start the clock," she said aloud, though she was the only human in the room. She placed her index and middle fingers precisely on the center of the pup's sternum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She compressed the chest rapidly, the fragile cartilage giving way under her touch. She paused, clamped her mouth over the pup's tiny snout, and blew a short, controlled puff of air into its lungs. The tiny chest rose, then fell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another breath. The wolf behind her let out a sound that was half growl, half sob. It sounded entirely too human. "Quiet," Lisa snapped, not breaking her rhythm. "Your panic isn't helping him. Keep your aura pulled back. You're smothering the room." For a moment, the hair on the back of Lisa's neck stood on end. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. Not his generals, not his council, and certainly not an exiled healer living on the ragged edge of the territory. But the crushing, heavy scent of pine and ozone that characterized his aura abruptly dialed back, pulling into a tight, coiled knot in the corner of the room. The beast was listening. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breath. Sweat beaded on Lisa's forehead. 2 minutes had passed. In neonatal terms, 2 minutes without oxygen was an eternity. The blue tint on the pup's gums wasn't fading. "Come on, little one," Lisa coaxed, her voice tight but remarkably steady. She adjusted her hand placement, applying a fraction more pressure. "You survived the cold. You survived the jaws of a beast. You don't get to quit on this table. Breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breath. Nothing." The room was tomb silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the storm lashing against the window panes. Lisa's arms ached. The clinical detachment she relied on began to fray at the edges, threatening to let in the crushing weight of grief. She pushed it back. She refused to lose a life tonight. She grabbed a tiny vial of epinephrine from her emergency kit, snapping the top off with her thumb. Using a microscopic needle, she injected a carefully calculated drop directly into the muscle of the pup's hind leg. "Last chance, little fighter," she whispered. She resumed the compressions. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, beneath her fingertips, a faint, erratic flutter. Lisa froze, holding her breath. The pup's chest jerked. A tiny, wet cough sputtered from its throat, expelling a drop of muddy water. Then, the pup drew in a ragged, gasping breath. The chest expanded on its own. A second later, a high-pitched, reedy wail pierced the heavy silence of the clinic. The pup was crying. Behind her, the sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone echoed through the room. Lisa didn't turn around immediately. She grabbed a warmed towel from the incubator, wrapping the squalling, squirming pup securely. Only when the infant's breathing steadied into a rapid, healthy rhythm did she turn. Where the monstrous wolf had stood, a man now knelt on the blood-stained tiles. He was entirely naked, his heavily muscled chest heaving as he gasped for air. Dark hair clung to his forehead, and his golden eyes, slowly fading back to a piercing human hazel, stared up at her. Alpha King David looked utterly destroyed, and yet completely terrifying. "There are scrubs in the bottom drawer of that cabinet," Lisa said, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She kept her eyes fixed on the whimpering bundle in her arms, deliberately granting the king a moment of privacy. "I suggest you put them on before you catch hypothermia." She heard the heavy, wet slide of skin against tile as David pulled himself up. The silence in the clinic was thick, broken only by the rhythmic, glorious sound of the pup crying and the rustle of cotton as David dressed. Lisa moved to the incubator, placing the wrapped pup inside and adjusting the temperature dial. The neon lights hummed above them, casting long, stark shadows across the room. "Is he?" David's voice was a low rumble, raw and grating, as if he hadn't spoken in human tongue for days. It lacked the usual booming authority that commanded armies. Right now, it was just the voice of a man standing on the edge of a precipice. "He is stable," Lisa replied, turning to face him. David had managed to pull on the oversized green scrub pants, leaving his broad, scarred chest bare to the cold air of the clinic. The physical presence of the man was overwhelming. Even exhausted, covered in his own blood and the mud of the forest, he radiated an intense, undeniable power. He was a king in every line of his body, from the sharp, aristocratic cut of his jaw to the heavy, calculating stare that was currently fixed on her. "You brought him back," David said, stepping closer. He looked at the incubator, his large hand hovering over the clear plastic lid, afraid to touch it. He was gone. I felt his heart stop a mile from here. "I bought him time," Lisa corrected, moving to the sink to wash the blood from her hands. The hot water stung the raw patches on her skin, but it grounded her. He suffered severe hypothermia and fluid in the lungs. It was a near thing, Alpha. "David," he said sharply, his gaze snapping to her. "Tonight, just David." Lisa grabbed a paper towel, drying her hand slowly. "All right, David. Care to tell me why the Alpha King of the Western Territories just kicked down my door in beast form, carrying a half-drowned newborn?" She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. She knew she was pushing a boundary. As an unaffiliated wolf, living on the absolute fringe of his territory, she was supposed to bow her head and offer deference. But deference didn't save lives, and right now, she needed answers to keep this pup alive. David's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, staring out the window at the pitch-black, rain-lashed forest. The muscle in his cheek feathered. "There was an ambush," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "At the northern border. A rogue pack crossed the river." "Rogues?" Lisa frowned, stepping forward. "Rogues don't have the coordination to breach the northern border. That's heavily fortified." "They had help," David said darkly, his hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory glint. "They knew the patrol routes. They knew exactly where the carriage was." "Carriage?" Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She looked back at the tiny pup in the incubator. The silver down on its head was drying, revealing a distinct pattern. She walked over, gently lifting the towel to expose the pup's left shoulder. There, stark against the pale skin, was a birthmark in the shape of a jagged crescent moon. Lisa sucked in a sharp breath. The royal mark. "David," she whispered, her eyes wide as she looked back at him. "You don't have a mate. You don't have an heir. Whose pup is this?" David closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall. The sheer exhaustion radiating from him was palpable. "He is my brother's son," he said quietly. "Elias?" Lisa shook her head, confusion warring with shock. "Elias died 3 years ago, in the border wars." "He didn't," David said, opening his eyes to meet hers. The pain in his gaze was staggering. "He was captured, held in secret by the northern witches. They used him, bred him. Tonight, his mate, a captive wolf, managed to escape with the newborn. She crossed the border, running for the citadel. She didn't make it. The rogues caught her." Lisa felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "And Elias?" "Still a prisoner," David snarled softly, his hands curling into fists. "I was on patrol when I caught the scent of royal blood. By the time I found them, the mother was dead. The rogues had tossed the pup into the swollen river to drown. I tore through them, dove in, and pulled him out." He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she had to look up to meet his eyes. The scent of rain, blood, and fierce, protective alpha rolled off him in waves. "I couldn't go to the citadel," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Whoever helped those rogues breach the border is inside my court. My royal physicians, my guards. I don't know who I can trust." He looked down at her, his expression a mix of desperate command and pleading vulnerability. "I only knew of you, the outcast healer who turns no one away, the woman who doesn't play pack politics. You brought a target to my door," Lisa realized, the gravity of the situation crashing down on her. "I brought you a life to save," David countered, his eyes locked on hers. "And you did." The storm outside seemed to intensify, rattling the thin glass panes of the clinic windows. Inside, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic hum of the incubator and the heavy breathing of the Alpha King. Lisa stood her ground, feeling the magnetic, oppressive pull of David's presence, but refusing to let it cow her. "He needs continuous monitoring," Lisa said, turning her back on David to check the pup's oxygen saturation levels. "His lungs have suffered trauma. Secondary drowning is a real risk over the next 48 hours, not to mention infection from whatever was in that river water." "Then you will monitor him," David stated. It wasn't a request. It was a royal decree, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who was used to the world bending to his will. "I will," Lisa agreed, writing down the pup's vitals on a clipboard. "Right here, in my clinic. I have the equipment, the sterile environment, and the isolation he requires." "No." The word cracked through the air like a whip. Lisa paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She turned slowly, meeting David's hard gaze. "No, you cannot stay here," David said, his tone brokering absolutely no argument. He stepped further into the light, the sheer size of him making the small room feel like a trap. "The rogues who attacked the carriage, I killed most of them, but not all. If they tracked my scent, if they realize I pulled the pup from the river, they will come here. This building is made of wood and glass, Lisa. It offers no protection. It has iron-warded locks and a reinforced basement," Lisa countered defensively, her chin tilting up. "I've handled rogue attacks before." "Not an organized hit squad paid by a traitor in my own court," David growled, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his bare chest. "I will not risk my nephew's life, and I will not risk yours. You are packing your medical supplies right now. You are coming back to the royal estate with me." Lisa's heart slammed against her ribs, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. The royal estate. Just the words tasted like ash in her mouth. She had spent the last 5 years building a life out here in the quiet, damp fringes of the territory, specifically to avoid the stone walls and gilded cages of the pack house. "I can't go to the pack house," Lisa said, her voice dropping, tight with a panic she fought to conceal. "You said it yourself, David. You don't know who the traitor is. Taking the pup into the heart of the Citadel is walking him straight into the snake pit." "I am the king," David said, his eyes narrowing, his aura flaring with a sudden, suffocating intensity that forced Lisa to take half a step back. "Within the walls of my estate, I can lock down entire wings. I have personal guards sworn to me by blood oath. Out here, you are sitting ducks." He leaned down slightly, his face inches from hers. "You are coming with me, Lisa. Do not make me issue an alpha command." The threat hung in the air, heavy and violent. As an unaffiliated wolf, Lisa was technically bound by the Alpha King's command, if he chose to force it upon her. It would strip her of her free will, a sensation she knew far too well and feared more than death itself. She looked at his eyes, searching the golden depths. Beneath the anger and the dominance, she saw the raw, bleeding desperation of an uncle terrified of losing the last piece of his brother. Her gaze shifted to the incubator. The pup shifted in his sleep, a tiny, fragile sigh escaping his lips. He was completely defenseless. A pawn in a deadly political game he hadn't even opened his eyes to see yet. Lisa took a slow, deep breath, forcing her own jagged trauma back down into the dark corners of her mind. "If I go with you," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I go as the boy's physician. Not as your subject. Not as a member of your pack." David's expression remained stony, but the crushing weight of his aura retreated slightly. "Agreed." "And I have full authority over his medical care," Lisa pressed, pointing a finger at his chest, stopping just short of touching him. "If I say a room is off limits to everyone, including you, you respect it. If you want him to live, you do not interfere with my work. My word on his health is absolute law. Do we have an understanding?" David looked at the small, fierce woman standing before him. She was half his size, wearing a blood-stained shirt, entirely lacking in the physical strength needed to challenge him. Yet her spirit was a fortress of iron. A small measure of respect, completely unbidden, flickered in his chest. "We have an understanding," David rasped. He turned toward the door. "Gather what you need. My SUV is hidden a quarter-mile down the logging road. We leave in 10 minutes. Lisa didn't waste another second. She began throwing sterile supplies, IV bags, and monitors into a large duffel bag. As she worked, She caught her reflection in the glass cabinet. Her eyes were wide, shadowed with ghosts she thought she had left behind. She was walking back into the fire, into the very place that had broken her. But she looked at the tiny, breathing bundle in the incubator, and she knew she had no choice. She had brought him back to life. Now, she had to keep him alive. The drive to the royal estate was a masterclass in suffocating silence. David drove his black, armored SUV with a terrifying, white-knuckled intensity, tearing through the winding, rain-slicked logging roads as if the hounds of hell were snapping at the tires. In the passenger seat, Lisa kept one hand securely on the portable transport incubator strapped tightly between them. Inside, the tiny pup, whom she had quietly decided to call Leo in her own mind until he was officially named, slept a fragile, medicated sleep. Every jolt of the vehicle sent a spike of anxiety through Lisa's chest. She kept her eyes fixed on the digital readouts of the portable monitor, watching the rhythmic, green spikes of the pup's heart rate. "We are crossing the inner perimeter," David said, his voice breaking the hour-long silence. It was gravelly, still holding the rough edges of his wolf. "The security detail will want to inspect the vehicle. Keep the boy covered." Lisa didn't argue. She carefully draped a thick, dark woolen blanket over the clear plastic of the incubator, obscuring the royal birthmark and the silver down of the infant's hair. A moment later, the dense tree line broke, revealing the towering, imposing silhouette of the pack house against the stormy night sky. It wasn't just an estate. It was a modernized fortress of steel, dark stone, and reinforced glass, practically humming with the latent energy of hundreds of wolves. For Lisa, the sight of it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. 5 years ago, she had walked out of those heavy iron gates with nothing but the clothes on her back, her reputation shredded by pack politics she had refused to play. The metallic taste of old adrenaline flooded her mouth. She swallowed it down. Focus on the patient, she reminded herself. Nothing else matters. The SUV rolled to a halt before a massive steel barricade. 3 heavily armed guards stepped out of the driving rain, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The lead guard, a tall, broad-shouldered wolf with a scarred chin, approached the driver's side. David rolled the window down just a fraction. The scent of ozone and dominant alpha instantly flooded out, hitting the guards like a physical wall. The lead guard immediately bared his neck in submission, stepping back. "Alpha," the guard stammered, his eyes darting to the shadowed interior of the cab. "We didn't expect you back until dawn." The perimeter alarm was tripped by my passage, David interrupted smoothly, his tone brokering absolutely zero room for inquiry. "Open the gates, Marcus." Marcus hesitated, a brief, barely perceptible flicker of curiosity crossing his face as he looked past David toward Lisa and the bulky, blanket-covered shape beside her. "Of course, Alpha. But protocol dictates a visual sweep of the interior for any returning." A low, vibrating growl ripped from David's chest, vibrating the heavy glass of the windows. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise of immediate, lethal violence. I said, "Open the gates. If you delay me another second, Marcus, I will mount your head on them." Marcus paled, stepping back rapidly and signaling the booth. The heavy steel barricade retracted with a mechanical groan. David didn't wait for it to fully clear before he gunned the engine, the SUV surging forward into the compound. Lisa kept her hand steady on the incubator, but her mind was racing. Marcus's hesitation wasn't normal for a guard facing down his Alpha King. It was too calculated. She glanced at David's rigid profile. The muscle in his jaw was ticking uncontrollably. "He shouldn't have questioned you," Lisa murmured, her eyes dropping back to the monitor. "No, he shouldn't have," David agreed, the steering wheel groaning under the pressure of his grip. Marcus was the one who assigned the patrol routes for the northern border tonight, the same routes the rogues bypassed. A cold chill, entirely unrelated to the damp air, slid down Lisa's spine. They were driving straight into a viper's nest, and the snakes were already watching the door. David bypassed the main entrance, steering the SUV toward an underground private garage reserved exclusively for the king. As the heavy blast doors sealed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the storm, the sudden quiet was deafening. "My private wing is on the 3rd floor. It has a separate ventilation system and biometric locks," David said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "No one enters without my physical presence or a master override. We set up the clinic there." Lisa nodded, moving methodically to unstrap the incubator. As David came around to her side of the vehicle, he didn't wait for her to struggle with the heavy equipment. He reached in, his large hands easily lifting the transport unit while being meticulously careful not to jostle it. Their arms brushed. His skin was burning hot, radiating the unnatural heat of a wolf whose beast was fighting to claw its way back to the surface. "Stay close to my back," David ordered softly, his hazel eyes locking onto hers in the dim light of the garage. "From this moment on, trust no one but me." 24 hours had passed since they breached the royal estate, and the silence in the king's private wing was thick enough to carve with a scalpel. Lisa had transformed David's sprawling, opulent study into a sterile neonatal intensive care unit. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the reinforced windows, and the scent of old leather and cedar was now entirely masked by the sharp and stringent smell of medical-grade disinfectant. In the center of the room, little Leo rested inside a top-of-the-line stationary incubator David had procured in absolute secrecy. The pup was stable, but his condition remained precarious. The exposure to the freezing river had severely compromised his immune system. Lisa sat slumped in an armchair beside the incubator, rubbing her burning eyes. She hadn't slept for more than 20 minutes at a time. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but her clinical focus remained razor-sharp. The heavy mahogany door clicked, the biometric lock disengaging with a soft beep. David entered, carrying a tray of food. He looked almost as haggard as Lisa felt. He was dressed in a simple black t-shirt and sweatpants, his dark hair messy, the shadows under his eyes speaking of his own sleepless vigil. He hadn't left the wing once. "You need to eat," David said, setting the tray on a side table. The scent of roasted meat and warm bread briefly overpowered the antiseptic smell. "And you need to sleep. I can watch the monitors for an hour." "I'm fine," Lisa lied, not looking away from the pup's steady breathing. "His temperature is hovering at the low end of normal. I want to be awake if it dips." David walked over, standing so close behind her chair that she could feel the heat radiating from him. The intense, dominant aura that usually surrounded him was completely pulled back, replaced by a heavy protective warmth. It was disarming. It made Lisa acutely aware of her own vulnerability. "You're running yourself into the ground, Lisa," David murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the quiet room. "You can't save him if you collapse." "I won't collapse," she replied, her voice tight. She finally looked up at him, her defenses flaring slightly. "I survived 5 years alone in the borderlands. I know my limits, Alpha." David's jaw tightened at the formal title. He reached out, his large hand hovering over her shoulder, before he gently allowed his fingers to rest against the side of her neck. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity straight to her toes. "I told you," he said softly, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair away from her collarbone. "Just David. And I know you're a survivor. That's why I brought him to you. But you don't have to carry the entire weight of this alone tonight." Lisa swallowed hard, her heart doing a treacherous stutter in her chest. The sheer physical magnetism of the man was intoxicating, pulling at the long-buried instincts of her inner wolf. But this was dangerous territory. He was the king. She was an exile. This proximity was a temporary alliance built on a foundation of mutual desperation. "David," she started, intending to pull away, Suddenly, a sharp, shrill beep cut through the heavy air. Lisa spun back to the incubator. The digital temperature readout, which had been holding steady at a warm 98.6 degrees, was rapidly dropping. 96 point, 94.5, 92.0. "What's wrong?" David demanded, his protective warmth instantly vanishing, replaced by the terrifying, lethal sharpness of a predator. "The incubator is failing," Lisa said, her hands flying over the control panel. She slammed the manual override button, but the screen glitched, flashing erratic numbers before going completely black. A blast of icy, refrigerated air suddenly poured from the unit's vents, blowing directly onto the fragile pup. "It's not failing," Lisa realized, her blood running cold as the implications hit her. She ripped the lid of the incubator open, scooping the shivering pup into her arms and wrapping him tightly in a thermal blanket. "It's been hacked. The climate control system for the unit is tied into the estate's mainframe. Someone intentionally reversed the thermal coils to freeze him." David's eyes flared an unholy, luminous gold. A growl so deep it shook the floorboards ripped from his chest. "I isolated the network. Only a Class A override could bypass the firewall." "Someone with high-level clearance," Lisa said, pressing the pup securely against her own chest, using her body heat to counter the sudden chill. Leo let out a weak, pathetic whimper that felt like a knife twisting in her heart. "Lock the door," David ordered, turning on his heel. His body was already beginning to tremble, the sheer, violent rage threatening to force his shift. "Do not open it for anyone. I am going to the main server room." "David, wait!" Lisa called out. But the heavy mahogany door had already slammed shut behind him, the biometric lock re-engaging with a solid click. She was alone. Lisa backed away from the door, moving to the furthest corner of the study. She sat on the floor, pulling her knees up to shield the pup, holding him tightly against her racing heart. The sudden drop in temperature had shocked his tiny system. His breathing was shallow, his small hands curled into tight, pale fists. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered frantically, rubbing her hand briskly over his back through the thermal blanket. "I've got you. I've got you." The room was deathly quiet, save for the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Lisa's eyes darted around the shadowed study, cataloging her surroundings. Heavy desk, glass cabinets, a heavy brass floor lamp, a cart of medical supplies. If whoever hacked the system realized their remote assassination attempt had failed, they would likely resort to physical means. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Then she heard it. It wasn't a knock. It was the soft, electronic trill of the biometric lock on the main door. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. David had said only he could open that door, but someone had just bypassed the firewall. If they had a Class A override, they could open the door. The heavy mahogany swung open silently. A figure stepped into the dim light of the study. He was dressed in the dark, tactical gear of the Royal Guard, a suppressed pistol held loosely in his right hand. The ambient light from the hallway illuminated his face. It was Marcus, the captain of the guard. "He really should have installed manual deadbolts," Marcus murmured, his voice terrifyingly casual as he stepped inside and allowed the door to click shut behind him. His eyes locked onto Lisa, huddled in the corner. "Hand over the pup, Lisa. This doesn't have to be messy. You're in exile. This isn't your fight." Lisa didn't move, her grip on the blanket tightening. "You sold out your king. You gave the rogues the patrol routes." "I secured the future of the pack," Marcus corrected, taking a slow step forward. "Elias was weak. David is too emotionally volatile. The Northern Witches promised us a true, pure-blood alpha in exchange for the boy. A trade, Lisa. One half-breed pup for the prosperity of the entire Western Territory." "He's the king's nephew," Lisa snarled, her own eyes flashing a brief, dangerous amber. She couldn't shift. She needed her hands to hold the pup, but the sheer maternal instinct of her inner wolf roared in her head. "He's a complication," Marcus sighed, raising the pistol. "I'm sorry, Lisa. I really am. But I can't let David find him alive." Marcus lunged forward to grab the bundle. Lisa didn't cower. She had spent 5 years treating trauma. She knew exactly how bodies worked and how to break them. As Marcus reached down, Lisa threw herself forward, not away from him, but directly inside his guard. With her left arm clutching the pup securely to her chest, she used her right hand to snatch the heaviest object off the bottom of the medical cart. A solid steel, portable D-cylinder oxygen tank. With a feral scream, Lisa swung the heavy steel cylinder upward in a brutal arc. The heavy metal smashed directly into Marcus's kneecap with a sickening crack. Marcus roared in agony, his leg buckling instantly. The suppressed pistol fired wildly into the ceiling as he crashed to the floor. But he was a trained alpha guard. Even with a shattered knee, he backhanded Lisa violently across the face. The force of the blow threw her backward. She hit the floor hard, twisting her body at the last second to take the brunt of the impact on her shoulder, shielding the pup. Her vision exploded with white stars, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. Marcus was already dragging himself forward, his eyes wild with pain and fury, reaching for his dropped weapon. Lisa scrambled backward, her hand desperately searching the fallen medical cart. Her fingers wrapped around the smooth plastic of the defibrillator paddles. She didn't have time to use the gel. She cranked the dial to maximum joules with her thumb. As Marcus lunged, grabbing her ankle with a crushing grip, Lisa slammed both paddles directly into his chest armor and hit the discharge buttons. The loud thwack of the electrical discharge echoed through the room. The sheer voltage short-circuited the tactical armor and seized Marcus's heart. He convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back in his head before he slumped forward, dead weight onto the carpet. Lisa scrambled away, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she clutched the crying pup tightly to her. The door to the study practically exploded inward, torn off its hinges in a shower of splintered wood. David stood in the doorway, fully shifted. The massive, midnight black beast was a nightmare of muscle and fury, its jaws dripping with saliva, eyes blazing with a terrifying, apocalyptic rage. It took one look at Marcus's unconscious body. Then its golden eyes snapped to Lisa. Lisa sat on the floor, a blooming bruise on her cheek, blood on her lip, holding the squalling pup against her chest. She looked up at the monstrous beast, and for the first time, she didn't see a threat. "It was Marcus," Lisa gasped out, her voice trembling but unbroken. The danger was inside the house. The beast let out a low, shuddering breath, the murderous tension draining from its massive frame. Slowly, painstakingly, the bones cracked and shifted as the king returned to his human form, falling to his knees before her, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just fought a trained killer to save his bloodline. David remained on his knees for a long, fractured moment, his massive chest heaving as the last vestiges of his wolf retreated beneath his skin. The air in the study was thick, practically unbreathable, choked with the smell of ozone from the defibrillator discharge, the coppery tang of blood, and the acrid stench of burnt tactical armor. Slowly, David reached out. His hands, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the shift, hovered over Lisa. He didn't look at Marcus's body. His entire universe had narrowed down to the bruised, exhausted woman on his floor, and the tiny, squalling bundle clutched desperately to her chest. "You're bleeding," David rasped, his voice tearing at the silence. Lisa flinched as his thumb gently brushed the corner of her split lip. The touch was agonizingly tender for a man who had just torn a heavy mahogany door off its iron hinges. "It's not mine," she whispered, her eyes dropping to the dead guard. "Well, the lip is. The rest is his." David finally shifted his gaze to Marcus, His golden eyes hardened into chips of cold, unyielding flint. He reached out, his fingers finding the pulse point at Marcus's throat. Nothing. The electric shock, combined with the blunt force trauma, had stopped the traitor's heart instantly. He was going to kill the pup, Lisa said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline crash was hitting her like a freight train. He bypassed the thermal controls. When that didn't work, he came in himself. I know, David said softly. He smoothly slid one arm behind Lisa's back and the other under her knees, lifting her effortlessly from the floor. He didn't ask for permission. He simply gathered her and the pup against his chest, stepping carefully over the ruined door and out into the shadowed hallway. Lisa didn't fight him. For the first time in 5 years, she let herself lean into someone else's strength. The steady, powerful rhythm of David's heart beneath his shirt grounded her erratic pulse. "Where are we going?" she asked, her head resting against his collarbone. "The inner vault," David replied, his stride long and purposeful. "It's a Faraday cage. No network connections. Mechanical locks only. It was built for the royal family to survive a siege." He carried her down a winding stone corridor that seemed to delve deep into the bedrock of the estate. The opulence of the upper floors gave way to stark, utilitarian reinforced concrete. They stopped before a massive steel door secured by a heavy, manual wheel. David set Lisa down gently on her feet, keeping one hand securely on her waist to steady her, while he spun the wheel with a harsh grate of metal. The vault was surprisingly warm, lined with cots, emergency medical supplies, and non-perishable rations. In the corner sat an old-fashioned, manually operated incubator, a relic, but a functional one. Lisa immediately moved to it, plugging it into the vault's independent power supply. As the coils began to heat, she unwrapped Leo. The pup's skin was mottled from the cold exposure, his breathing terribly shallow again. "I need the portable oxygen tank," Lisa commanded, her clinical detachment snapping back into place to hold back her panic. "And the IV fluids. Get them from my bag." David moved without hesitation, handing her the supplies with the precision of a surgical nurse. For the next hour, neither of them spoke. They moved in a synchronized dance of desperation. Lisa inserted a microscopic IV line into the pup's fragile umbilical vein, pushing warmed saline and broad-spectrum antibiotics to fight the shock and potential infection. David held the tiny oxygen mask in place, his massive, scarred hands terrifyingly gentle. Only when the pup's color slowly returned to a healthy, flushed pink, and his chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, did Lisa step back. She collapsed onto one of the cots, burying her face in her hands. "You haven't changed," David said quietly from the other side of the room. Lisa looked up through her fingers. David was sitting beside the incubator, watching her. "5 years ago," David continued, his voice heavy with the ghosts of the past. "You defied the council. You dragged a rogue Omega into your clinic and refused to let him bleed out, even though my father ordered you to stand down. You sacrificed your reputation, your rank, and your home for a life that pack politics deemed worthless." Lisa swallowed hard, the old wounds aching. "A life is a life. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't check pack affiliations. I was on the Eastern Front when it happened," David said, his gaze dropping to his hands. "When I returned, my father was dead. I was crowned king, and you were gone. Exiled." He looked back up, his hazel eyes piercing through the dim light of the vault. "I spent a year looking for you. By the time I found out where you had settled, I thought it was safer to let you stay hidden. I thought my world was too dangerous for you." He let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "And tonight, I dragged my world straight to your doorstep." "You brought me a patient, David," Lisa said softly, the formal titles entirely forgotten in the dark, quiet space. "And I did what I always do. I fought for him." "You fought a fully trained Alpha Guard with an oxygen tank," David corrected, a faint, disbelieving smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "You're a terrifying woman, Lisa." The silence in the vault stretched, comfortable but heavy with unspoken truths. Lisa watched David as he watched the pup. The harsh overhead lighting cast deep shadows across the king's face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into his features. He had saved the pup, but his pack was fractured. Treason had taken root in his own home. "I have to go back up," David said suddenly, his voice hardening, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing. Marcus wasn't working alone. To bypass the firewall and stage an ambush on a royal carriage, he needed accomplices, lieutenants, sympathizers. Lisa sat up straight, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "David, you can't just walk out there. You don't know who is loyal." "I am the Alpha King," David growled softly, the latent power in his blood rising to the surface, filling the small room with the sharp scent of ozone. "They will bare their necks to me, or I will tear them out. There is no middle ground tonight." He stood up, his physical presence commanding and lethal. He walked to the heavy steel door, pausing with his hand on the wheel. He looked back at Lisa, his expression softening just a fraction. "Lock this door from the inside," he ordered. "There's a heavy iron deadbolt. Throw it. Do not open it for anyone, not even if they sound like me. I will use the emergency comms on the wall to verify my identity when I return." Lisa stood, walking over to the door. She looked up at him, her heart aching at the sheer burden resting on his broad shoulders. "Be careful," she whispered. It was a stupid, inadequate thing to say to a king going to war in his own house, but it was all she had. David reached out, his knuckles brushing her unbruised cheek. "Keep him breathing, Lisa." With that, he hauled the heavy door open, stepped into the dark corridor, and pulled it shut behind him. Lisa immediately threw the massive iron deadbolt. The metallic clang echoed with terrifying finality in the small vault. She was sealed in. The next 3 hours were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. Lisa busied herself with Leo, checking his vitals every 15 minutes, adjusting the IV drip, and meticulously logging his progress. The pup was a fighter. Despite the hypothermia, the near drowning, and the deliberate temperature drop, his heart was beating with the strong, stubborn rhythm of his bloodline. But the silence outside the vault was deafening. Because the room was a Faraday cage, Lisa couldn't hear the screams. She couldn't hear the snarls of shifting wolves or the heavy thud of bodies hitting the marble floors above. She was entirely cut off from the violence she knew was tearing the packhouse apart. She paced the length of the vault, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Every time a pipe groaned or the ventilation system hummed, she jumped. The clinical detachment she relied on was gone, replaced by a raw, gnawing fear for the man who had left her here. Finally, just as the digital clock on the wall clicked to 5 a.m., the emergency comms unit crackled to life with a burst of static. "Lisa." It was David. His voice was hoarse, ragged, and utterly exhausted. Lisa lunged for the button. "I'm here. Are you... Is it over?" "It's over," he replied. The sheer weight of the night dragged on those 2 words. "Open the door." Lisa threw the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wheel. The door swung open. David stood in the corridor. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and barely made it out. His black t-shirt was torn and soaked with blood. None of it his own. His knuckles were bruised and split, and there was a dark smear of soot across his cheek. But his eyes, though heavy, were clear. The feral, unhinged rage of the beast was gone, replaced by the grim, sorrowful calm of a king who had just executed his own men. He stepped into the vault, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak. He just walked toward the sink in the corner, turning on the tap and staring blankly at the water running over the stainless steel. Lisa didn't ask questions. She didn't ask how many had died. She walked over to the medical supplies, grabbed a clean towel, and ran it under warm water. She stepped beside him, gently taking his massive, bloodied hands in hers. David flinched slightly at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Lisa meticulously wiped the blood from his knuckles, her touch light and reverent. "You did what you had to do," she said softly, keeping her eyes on his hands. "To protect the pup, to protect the pack." 6, David whispered, his voice cracking. 6 of my personal guard. Men I trained with. Men I broke bread with. They traded Elias to the witches, and they were willing to drown his son for power. He slowly pulled his hands from hers, turning to face her. The emotional barrier he had kept up all night finally shattered. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. Lisa let out a shaky breath, her hands coming up to rest lightly on his chest. "The rot is gone, Lisa," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips. "The estate is secure. You're safe." The Alpha King's beast had kicked down her door, bringing a corpse, but the woman with the iron will and the healer's hands had handed him back a king. Together, they had survived the night, purged the rot from the pack, and secured a future that was written in the golden eyes of a tiny, breathing pup. The war with the Northern Witches was only just beginning, but as Lisa looked out over the Western territories from the heavy glass windows of the estate, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. If you enjoyed this cinematic, heart-pounding journey of survival, betrayal, and unexpected love, please leave a like, share this story with your fellow fiction lovers, and subscribe for more intense, grounded romance dramas.